So I am recording the session. Ladies, if you'd like to go ahead and get started, without further ado, here's Bethany and Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So we would like to start this off by giving a land acknowledgement, since we are recognizing the University of Illinois, and also because Bethany and I both reside within this community. And so we feel it is important to begin by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Waya, Miami, Muscotan, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of the Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So you can go to the next slide, Bethany. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about today, we're going to give you a little bit of a background on the University of Illinois Archives, a brief history and examples of some contemporary collecting projects, and takeaways and considerations for doing contemporary collecting. And we're especially stressing the word considerations because we're in the midst of kind of discussing a lot of these ideas of how contemporary collecting has evolved with some of the work that we've done. And that while we may have come up with some temporary solutions, we want to make it known that there are some areas where maybe everything hasn't been perfectly resolved and that we may need to revisit some of this. And of course, we're open to any type of feedback and suggestions that any of you may have to offer, because I know that there are many of you who have thought about similar projects and are doing some amazing work. So next slide.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. So just to provide some brief background about the University of Illinois Archives, where Jessica and I both work. The University of Illinois Archives was established in 1963, and it is one of several special collections units that are part of the University of Illinois Library. In addition to records and personal papers related to the university, the archives holds materials related to several professional organizations, including the American Library Association, the Ad Council, and the 3rd Armored Division. The archives has programmatic areas in faculty papers, fine and applied arts, including the Sousa Archives and Center for American Music, multicultural collections and services, natural and applied sciences, and student life and culture. And while we acquire institutional records and faculty and alumni papers, we also have a history of documenting current events on campus. So for example, the first university archivist, Maynard Britchford, had done a lot of work to acquire materials related to current student life and also documenting current science. And he argued that the archivist should spend most of the time out of the office and engaging with campus life and activities. So now I will turn it over to Jessica, who will discuss a couple examples of collecting the present.
So in 2001, student life and culture archivist Ellen Swain conducted a documentation project that gave the university community an opportunity to reflect about the tragic events surrounding 9/11. The project, while very public, had anonymous responses. Ellen also included a statement saying this space is being provided for the university community to express our emotions about the tragedy the nation is facing. Our hope for this space is to promote a civil and supportive atmosphere for the entire campus. Please be respectful of your fellow students, faculty, staff, and extended university family. The project definitely received a variety of responses, from a call for peace, the need to stand in solidarity with one another. Some responses maybe were not may have been considered somewhat controversial, but it really did help to show and reflect how people were grieving and thinking about this experience. And there were even some responses and reflections that were in various languages as well. And you can go to the next slide. So 20 years later, many of our projects have moved a little bit more from an analog approach to more of a digital approach. And while using digital methodology has its advantages, especially when you're trying to navigate documentation projects during a pandemic, when we're not always able to gather as much as we'd like, there definitely can be some challenges and even some responsibilities that can be placed on archivists. So some of this is a little bit, what I'm about to discuss is a little bit of a recap from a presentation that I was a part of on Juneteenth of this past 2020. It was a virtual discussion facilitated by Burgess Jules, which featured various organizations, including Documenting the Now, the Blackivists, Witness, Texas After Violence Project, and Project Stand. And one of the discussions that I talked about was the record series, Being Black at Illinois. And this series documents protests, particularly around 2015, around the campus community, and the responses, particularly after a recent trial in Ferguson. And the collection, while very powerful with the imagery of students and different representation with the university community, helped to kind of tell the story about the responses and the way that people were feeling, required some concern even when they were initially transferred. There were discussions about making the content accessible, but of course trying to put in maybe some protocols about if any of this was to be used, that there needed to be, the university, of course, the archives needed to be tagged. There needed to be maybe a conversation, even with the donor, about how some of this might be used. However, and at that time, while there were certain factors such as facial recognition, we probably weren't thinking about some of the concerns maybe as clearly as we might think more around 2020 or 2021. And what actually made this conversation come more to light was a conversation that I had with Project Stand. There was interest in using these photos for the website. And while the photos especially are very powerful, there was an immediate concern about how this could possibly maybe negatively impact students that were part of this movement. And what also became more of a concern is realizing this content was donated by a staff member. And while that staff member works very closely with students, there was very limited student input when it came to acquiring this record series. So that prompted me to reach out to the donor to have a very honest conversation about how there is interest in wanting to use this series. However, it may not be best, particularly to just make it easily accessible even on Project Stand's website. And the donor appreciated the concern and offered to actually give us some other resources, such as a PowerPoint presentation, and just asked us to double check to make sure there weren't any pictures included, but the content could very much help to explain the movement. The donor also co-wrote an article that was published that helps to tell this story, and also tied in some other past movements on the University of Illinois' campus and how all of it kind of connected. So it ended up being a very positive experience because it was a way of us realizing that sometimes we do need to revisit what we've already done because maybe there's more concerns that have shown up. So in the present moment, we've decided that the records series can still be searchable. You can search it, you can read the description, but you won't be able, at least for now, to see the photos or the videos. There is a note that you can contact the university archives if you would like to receive access, but of course that will entail a discussion about how this content might be used and a proper consent form. And so we wanted to just make it clear that it's not that we want to restrict all of it, but there are some real concerns, and that we need to have more of a discussion about how some of this might be used. And ultimately, of course, we want to ensure that more safety is provided. And you can go to the next slide. So an alternative to point to actually is the Black Students for Revolution record series. And what's especially important about this record series is this organization worked very closely with former archives colleague Anna Trammell. And she has cultivated a relationship with this student group as they were visiting the archives multiple times to look at other collections. And that started a conversation about transferring some of their own records. So we do have a small series from them. And shortly after they donated some of their paper documents, then a conversation with Anna came about donating some digital files as well. And Anna worked closely with the students to make sure that they had input throughout this process and that the descriptions accurately reflected their materials. And they have a variety of records. They do have some photos and videos, but they also have flyers and pamphlets, and quite a bit of material that gives you such variety. And this is a series where I do plan on reaching out to the student group. Many of them have graduated, but there still are some around to make sure that they're still okay with the way that this is accessed, that this is accessible. But we have felt that it is important when we look at these two record series that one didn't really have student input, the Being Black at Illinois series, but the Black Students for Revolution record series very much had active student participation when it came to the transfer of these records. And you can go to the next slide. And these are just also some of the other quick things that you can find in the Black Students for Revolution series. So I will turn it over to Bethany now.
Thanks, Jessica. So the first example that I'm going to talk about relates to a controversy that the University Archives documented back in 2014 and 2015. In 2014, the University of Illinois Board of Trustees rescinded an offer of employment to Dr. Stephen Salaita after he had made comments on Twitter that were critical of Israel's military attacks in Gaza. Salaita had been previously offered a tenured position at the University of Illinois, and then it was withdrawn by the Chancellor, Phyllis Wise, shortly before he was due to move to Illinois. It was later revealed that the Chancellor and several other employees had used personal email accounts to discuss the matter in an effort to evade public disclosure. Several months later, in August of 2015, the Chancellor and Provost both resigned from their positions, and along with several other staff and administrators. So as the controversy unfolded, the archives wanted to set up a way to capture the university community's reaction as well as broader national media attention. Our colleague, Chris Prom, who is Associate Dean for Digital Strategies in the University of Illinois Library, had set up a project to capture the controversy. Since several people were working on this project together at the same time, the idea was to employ low barrier tools that would enable us to capture this content quickly. And we used tags or the Twitter archiving Google Sheet to capture tweets using the hashtag Salaita, and also used the Internet Archive's Save a Page plugin for Google Chrome, which enables anyone using a Chrome browser to right-click on a page and archive it. We use the tool to capture media stories, blogs, university websites, and Reddit forums on the Salaita controversy. The archived URLs were added to a Google Doc and organized by type of web page, such as university document or news media website, and then by date thereunder. The idea was to create something akin to an analog clippings file. The resulting document ended up being 147 page long, so we ended up collecting quite a few number of URLs. And while multiple people were able to easily implement and use the Save a Page plugin, we had to make sure that we weren't duplicating each other's work, which did happen a couple of times. So it was really important to communicate about who was capturing which web content, and also to make sure that we were checking the Google Doc as it was updated. And while this was a relatively easy method, the metadata that we have is pretty limited. And so we also collected some other digital materials in addition to this, which still are waiting to be processed, such as videos and other documents. And those were also ingested into our digital repository. Another contemporary collecting effort that some of the archives and other colleagues in the University Library participated in was documenting the local Women's March in Champaign-Urbana on January 21st, 2017. And we followed the guidance that had been set up by Daniel Russell and Katrina Van Dieven, as other repositories all over the country and the world were working to document the march in DC as well as their local marches. In Champaign-Urbana, or CU as we call it, there are several cultural heritage and institutions and repositories. So we wanted to make sure that we collaborated with the Champaign County Historical Archives, which is located at the Urbana Free Library, since the CU March was of the local community, which the Champaign County Historical Archives would be the appropriate repository for. So all of the posters and oral histories that we collected were given to the Champaign County Historical Archives, and we made sure to use their donation and interview forms and had meetings beforehand to make sure that we could coordinate our work with them. As a science archivist, one of the things that I'm really interested in is documenting current science. The University of Illinois has developed a number of innovations and research initiatives in response to COVID-19. And these projects range from studies to analyze and address the effects of the virus to the development of medical apparatus and testing mechanisms. So for example, researchers at Illinois developed the SHIELD saliva test to regularly screen all faculty, staff, and students twice a week or more. And that recently received FDA authorization as well. And the test results are pretty fast and you generally get them within 24 hours. And the university also had developed an accompanying app called Safer Illinois, where you can track your results. And then also it allows you to show a badge when you're entering a building to show whether you've had a recent negative test. In addition, other such projects include an emergency ventilator called Rapid Vent. And so I worked with the web archiving graduate assistant in the University of Illinois Library, Grace Moran, to decide on which sites to crawl and how frequently to crawl them. And we decided to crawl most of the sites on a monthly basis, especially those which appeared to be updated frequently. But there were also a handful of sites that we decided to just crawl once, such as news stories and publications that were related to some of these research projects. So I wanted to ensure that we captured documentation on the sites as well, such as license agreements that the research teams had provided, as well as manuals on how to implement and use some of these apparatus that they had developed, but also the associated publications with these research projects, such as this preprint that's here on the slide. And so we decided to crawl these types of documents only once. A longer term goal that I have is to reach out to some of these interdisciplinary scientific teams to conduct oral history interviews and learn more about the records that they've generated from these research projects. Related to this work, last year, Jessica and I developed a project to collect reflections from the campus community during the pandemic. We created a submission form for people to submit demographic information and upload a variety of types of digital materials. In the submission form that we created, the only question that we made mandatory is about whether the individual making the submission is a faculty member, student, alumni, or staff, and we made the rest of the questions optional. We also felt it was really important to enable people to be able to submit anonymously, also hearkening back to the original 9/11 project that Ellen Swain had done. We have definitely have some thoughts about how we would do similar contemporary collecting projects differently moving forward and how to ensure that we are approaching these projects ethically and with care. And on the following slide, we have a list of a few considerations that we think are important to bear in mind with such contemporary collecting projects. So now I will turn it over to Jessica to talk a bit about this.
Thank you. And just to add, there will be a little bit more discussion about the COVID documentation project during a Midwest Archives Conference presentation as well. And that it was very important for us to make sure that people aren't feeling any type of pressure to contribute to this type of project. especially with the COVID submission documentation project, there have been people that personally reached out that said, I really want to contribute, but I'm not in the space to do this right now, but I understand the importance of why you're documenting this project. And so we've tried to make it very clear that in no way do we want to pressure anyone to contribute. And of course, even once this project ends, people are always welcome to submit responses to us later. And I have personally told people that I also in the future would like to even contribute to the documentation, to contribute to some of the projects that my alma maters are working on as well. But I'm personally not at a point where I'm ready to do that as well, nor do I feel any type of pressure. And so that's something that we've made sure to emphasize, is that this space is provided for those who would like to share, and that there's an option of how much people would like to share, but that it's there, but it is of course not anything that we want to obligate anyone to do, as we personally are trying to work through this pandemic ourselves. And nothing will be accessible until we have done a very thorough review as well, because of course, like many of us, we are gradually learning about these best practices as well. And so you can go to the next slide. So some of the considerations and takeaways are our practices ethical? Is there proper consent? What records do we need to revisit in order to ensure that there are more ethical practices and policies put in place? Should we restrict accessibility of some of the records, as was kind of pointed out with the Being Black at Illinois series? And if so, how much do we restrict some of it? And unfortunately, that means some of these series might mean that there is limited accessibility, at least in the present moment, and that it could, limit those who could really use this material as valuable ways for research purposes. But we also recognize that there may be people who may misuse certain records other than their original intent. And as archivists, it is important to recognize that no matter how much we try to ensure ethical practices and proper copyright procedures, these may be challenges that we always are going to have to maybe reconsider and confront. And while that might be difficult, it shouldn't discourage us from recognizing potential concerns. And I will personally say some of it has resonated with me, as in 2015, when I was a grad student, I did participate in some Black Lives Matter rallies and other protests and movements. So it is on one end where, I think there's plenty of us that can provide a certain amount of empathy that some of us have been out there in those spaces, in that we personally could have been impacted. And it is important to make sure that we are thinking about that as well. And even if we haven't personally been impacted, the concerns, of course, should always be on our mind. And Sophia Noble notes that the right to control over group and personal identity and memory must become a matter of concern for archivists, librarians, and information workers. So now I'll let Bethany finish the rest.
And so also when thinking about collection scope, it's not just important to decide what to collect for these kinds of projects, but also to think about what's feasible to collect, and what resources do we have to collect the materials, and what kinds of appraisal considerations will be important to bring to bear on the materials. And these are projects that we should not just embark on alone either, but think about who are our stakeholders. Are there other repositories with whom we have overlapping collecting purviews and interests, or that we might partner with? And above all, think about how we, should be building relationships with the community which we seek to document, or for whom we seek to document. Archives are fundamentally about building relationships and documenting relationships. Engaging with donors and creators is a really vital part of that, so that we can not only better understand the context in which materials are created and used, but also develop more reciprocal and collaborative models for stewarding them. And as a part of that, we also really need to think about how we can employ responsible and ethical workflows and tools. And this might mean, in a sense, moving away from the idea of quote unquote rapid collecting and capturing large quantities of content, and instead, think about how we can consider moving towards what Kimberly Christian and Jane Anderson describe as slow archives, which is not necessarily meant to be opposed to the idea of fast, but as they write, slowing down is about focusing differently, listening carefully, and acting ethically. So we should ask ourselves, are we using tools that perpetuate and reinforce inequities? Are our workflows reinforcing inequities and causing harm? We need to do a lot of work and thinking before we embark on collecting the present. And so Jessica and I are not presenting any answers here at all, but we just wanted to share some of the challenges that we faced and that we think are important for the archival community to talk about. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts about that. And we also just prepared a slide with some references that we either used for this talk or some other resources that we've found to be useful. So happy to share that. And thank you so much. And we'd be happy to hear your questions and comments.
I'll let the virtual accolades pour in for you. You can watch the hands clap on the screen. So I'll remind everyone, if you want to pop some questions in the chat, I'm happy to share those. If you'd like to unmute yourself, please do so. Just let us know who you are, where you're from, and ask away. And I'll give a second if anybody wants to pop in. Otherwise, I have a question already ready to go. You're getting a lot of claps in the chat, by the way. Well, I'll kick it off. I have a question from Helen Conger, and you both have already touched on this a little bit, so maybe you could expand upon it. Helen asks, does the university archives have a time period where restrictions on access will expire for a collection like Being Black in Illinois records, or even all records? I'm guessing that university records are subject to open records laws, ?
Yeah, I can start, and Bethany can contribute more. Yes, we do. From what I understand, we do a lot of things case by case. There are some standard procedures that, depending on the type of information, we might restrict it for X amount of years and make sure that there is a note in place so that people are aware, just in case someone happens to leave, so that that information is clear. For Being Black at Illinois, I think we haven't really put a time limit on it. What was important really in the present moment was when it became very clear that there was limited student involvement, maybe we need to rethink this, that we wanted to just first, limit some of that accessibility, just to ensure that we were trying to make sure that we were trying just to ensure safety concerns. We have a small working group that has, discussed some of these concerns as well. I think what we've felt at this moment, just to be perfectly honest, is because we're not in the archives like we regularly are, and that there is somewhat, to a certain extent, of a disconnect, that we just didn't want to make a decision where we moved too quickly. And so we wanted to make it known, yes, the series exists. If you want to learn more about it, you can come talk to us. If there is an interest in using it, we can have a conversation to figure out what's the best use. So I would say specifically for Being Black at Illinois, it's something where we are taking it by case, because we wanted to make sure we're not doing something too quickly as well.
Sorry about that. I got another question here. How do you deal with Hipaa concerns in the COVID-19 submission?
Yeah, I can take that. Actually, one of the things that we discussed before we created the submission form, we had consulted with the university archivist and a number of others in the library before we made it go live. But we did put a note on there that we asked people to not explicitly include health information, just because we're not really set up in a way to to adequately kind of create access and manage access to that kind of information. However, in a pandemic where you're collecting information about people's experiences, that's something that is really difficult to not include. And on the other hand, we also had a conversation with a professor in the history department who focuses on the history of medicine, and thinking about what do we want to create as a record of this, for the future, for future researchers. And so having some of this sort of health related or public health related information would be really critical to that end. Like Jessica mentioned, this is something that we're going to have to review and spend some time reviewing before we decide how and to create access to the materials. But, it's definitely not perfect by any means. I don't know if Jessica has anything to add to that.
Well,
no, I have nothing to add.
In that same vein, I have a question that's kind of in the same vein that came from Kate, and I'll just read the text here. We solicited contributions, text and photos from our campus community about the pandemic experience. We got permission from some contributors to open their photos to public view immediately, but then realized that a lot of the photos are screenshots of Zoom meetings whose participants don't necessarily know they're being photographed. We have the same problem, Kate. Their faces and display names are visible. We ended up restricting the whole collection for now, but Kate is wondering if you've run into similar issues.
Yeah, I think we received a few submissions that do include group Zoom screenshots. So yeah, that again is something where, we would need to, carefully think about how we would create access. It might be the kind of thing where, we would create access in the reading room and have, some user consent mechanisms in place. We did also, it was optional, but submitters could include their email addresses. So if we do have concerns about some of the materials that were donated, we could certainly reach out to those folks and have a conversation further about that as well. So yeah.
I've got another question here. Ashley would like to know, what are some challenges to getting started in finding material?
I'm wondering if there could maybe, if Ashley could maybe expand upon that regarding COVID materials or protests or any other type of protests. I would say I don't know that it has been too much of a challenge with finding materials. And I think part of it is that in some ways, I don't know that we've necessarily had an intent on trying to specifically go out and acquire materials, but more so about when people come to us, what are the best practices and procedures that we should consider within that. And I think we've tried to be, very careful, especially this summer. There were questions about, what's the archives going to do to document this work? And I think for us, we kind of felt it's not necessarily our place to go out there and take pictures and document. But if people would like to send anything to us, how do we carefully examine this material? And I think it's also important to note, I had a great point that one of the Student Life and Culture archivist, Ellen Swain, brought up is we have so much material from protests, especially from the 1960s, but we didn't acquire all of it in the 1960s. A lot of that has been given to us over time. So I think that's been the main thing, is wanting to make sure that if people want to come to us, that they feel welcome to, with all the questions that are involved. And of course, that we're making sure that we are asking the right questions as well, and that no one, of course, should feel obligated. That's the challenging part, I think, for many of us, of wanting to make sure that we are encompassing the full picture of everything, but there's been a lot of discussions with archivists that some people want to be forgotten, and they very much have that right.
I'll pop in and say Ashley did say protests, but I think you covered that, but feel free to expand upon that if you'd like. But I will give you this next question. Nancy asks, are you requiring deed of gifts for submissions to the COVID project? They decided this was the way to go with their own project at Smith College.
We did not. We did include some language in the submission form, to let people know that these are materials that we would be making publicly accessible. However, in retrospect, I think that, would have been good to think about how we could have implemented some sort of deed of gift in that situation. So would love to hear how others have approached that as well too.
I've got a question here from, I think it's Lena. Do you have any advice for collecting materials directly from student organizations? Lena says we have the problem that students are not the most responsive to emails during the term, and then the turnover is high enough that they're constantly starting over to create those relationships.
Ellen Swain, of course, is a perfect person who can provide a lot of input given the many years that she's worked with student organizations. Some of what we've done is we obviously could not do it this past fall, but they have this event Quad Day, which is where all these student organizations are out on the quad, and we've gone to different organizations to talk about who we are. And that's been a positive way to have a little bit of communication. I have the fun part of going there because for some reason people still think I'm an undergrad. So people just love to tell me about their organization. So that's been a nice way to have some personal connection. And what's also been helpful is sometimes there are student organizations that have anniversaries coming up and they'll reach out to us and we try to make sure they have as much input as well in what they would like to see. So that's also been a way to even attract quite a few alumni. And there's been some great faculty that have worked with us as well that have had us come talk to classes. One area that I've found lately that's been helpful is having more of a connection with the cultural centers on campus, because a lot of the directors have close communication with quite a few student organizations. And especially that's been a relationship that Ellen Swain and Anna Trammell have both cultivated. And I have been able to work with some of them a little bit more with anniversaries. And so many of the directors have also just been communicating with us a little bit more. And so some of them have said, you know what, we have these student groups and they need to actually come talk to you. But Ellen Swain, I definitely recommend looking at some of the work that she's published as well. I know she did kind of a student archives consulting program. So she's someone that I get to talk to all the time about this because our offices are right next to each other, but even just reading what she's published, I think is a great resource.
Great. I do have a question from Matthew. How will these collections and projects that document the present help inform collecting decisions in the future? And how might they provide further insight into previous projects that document the past?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. For me, I guess one of the things that I've kind of thought of in reflecting on some of these contemporary collecting projects is the importance of engaging with donors and creators, and what you lose when you don't have that. So I think thinking more critically and carefully about how we can do that moving forward is something that would be really important. And yeah, and I think that even examining how we've approached these efforts over time is something really interesting to think about. As Jessica talked about, the 9/11 project, provided some really interesting and important things for us to think about in terms of providing a sort of safe space for people to share their reactions. But yeah, I don't know, just if you have anything else to add to that as well.
No, I think you said everything pretty well.
I'll hop back in. So kind of going back to that 9/11 collection project that you discussed at the top of the presentation, sometimes those kind of projects, especially in the immediate aftermath, and you see people donating those materials, they sometimes are maybe a little more, some are very heated, and then some are just hatred. So how do you contend with that kind of material that is more heat of the moment and or well less heat of the moment and more hatred filled? How do you contend with that, and how do you work with that material for long term, especially down the road, knowing that this may at some point become presentation material, exhibit material?
That's a really good question. That's requiring me to think a lot, and I'm sure I'm going to have lots of thoughts right after this ends, because that's how it always goes when you have a presentation, that all these things come to mind that you should have said. Um, I think what we often have to remind ourselves too is that, of course, there's going to be a lot of material, and there's definitely been material in the past that may not necessarily represent or reflect our personal views, but that perspective exists and it's out there. It's something even that I've realized, even as I've given instruction, of needing to sometimes remind students of, yeah, you might see some content that will depict blackface from the 1930s. That's not something that I personally enjoy looking at, but it's also part of the history. It exists. So I think it's important, keeping that in mind, but also thinking about, how that might be portrayed or discussed. But it is definitely one of those, challenging areas.
Great, and I have a comment. Steph says your framework around an ethic of care is so thoughtful. This feels like an authentic and holistic approach to archival work in academic archives. It's not a question, just a recognition that this work is hard work, heart work. I like that. This work is
Oh,
hard work. If anybody else, I'm monitoring the chat, but feel free, if anybody wants to pop in and ask a question in person or over the chat, you're welcome to do so. Well, I'm not seeing any takers, but I know that we are recording the session, and there were a request or two for your references, Jessica and Bethany. So we will get those references, that reference slide from you, and figure out how to share that to the wider audience. Elizabeth asks if we're going to send out the link to the recording. Yes, I know that we're saving it to the cloud, and we'll figure out how and where that's going to go, but we'll definitely let you know where that is. I do have a last minute question slipping in here. Do student donors always transfer the rights to the archives in the deed/donation forms? They're thinking about ownership of materials created by students.
that's a great question that, again, Ellen Swain is very much the expert. And especially when I've worked with some student groups, there's always that conversation, that we have. And one of the things that we are looking at, and there's been some great examples that that archivists from other institutions have provided, especially in terms of what a deed of gift form looks like. And There was one that was, what gets a little complicated at the University of Illinois. I know this is not the situation with every institution, and particularly not every state school. But what's a little challenging is that archival records, it really doesn't matter whether or not they're student, faculty, provost, it is seen as part of a university property and part of state property. And that gets a little interesting. And so there have been consent forms developed for working with specifically for student groups, but there has been a desire to, particularly work with administrators on making sure that it's drafted in the best way. It's been a little bit hard with communication, but Ellen and I recently talked about that's something that we need to also just revisit as well, because it is something that, we want to make sure is very understood, that while we may not always want to, that we don't always, I'm trying to say my words correctly, that is, a factor in these records, depending on how someone wants to look at it. It is officially, seen as something that is related to the state, and that is something that that really, it does not matter how our personal views are with that. And so it's making sure that we are complying, and that there's a lot of clarity about that, if that makes any sense.
I have one last question. Do you consult your university council with questions regarding restrictions on collections and access?
We have, definitely, particularly depending on what division it's referring to, if it's student affairs. There's a lot of various consulting as well. And what helps in a lot of ways, especially, is that we have quite a few individuals within the archives that have been affiliated with the university for a while. So there is a lot of institutional just knowledge, even for those of us who haven't been here as long, about, who it is that we should be asking the right questions to. So it is a matter where there's just a lot where we've had to take things by a case by case, and Bethany might have more to add.
Yeah, I think it is, essentially a case-by-case situation. And we have worked with legal counsel in the past to review, for example, our oral history interview agreement form, in addition to the current deed of gift that we use. So yeah, so there has been some case-by-case work in coordination with them as well.
Thank you.
I've got one last question, more of a procedural thing, I think, from Paul. Paul wants to know, how do you curate or process the materials that you have been given? Do your processors organize or arrange them, or are they treated as a single lump?
I guess I could just say that it's sort of a case-by-case situation, how we process materials. It really depends, what the materials are. Jessica mentioned this working group that we're part of, that, we're kind of thinking through more carefully how we will be, appraising and processing and making accessible some of these materials. So that's something that, I think that we're currently in the process of rethinking and reevaluating as well. So yeah, but I think it is, essentially on a case-by-case situation. With administrative records, we might, employ sort of a more MPLP kind of approach, but with, materials like faculty papers or alumni papers, would employ, more careful kind of approach in thinking about how we want to arrange and describe those materials. So I don't know if Jessica has anything else to add to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say we're in an interesting position where we have 3 different service points as well. So we're in 3 different locations, and So with our collection scope, sometimes there are certain, as Bethany kind of echoed, where certain series might look a little differently. I mean, I think a perfect example is the Sousa Archives and Center for American Music, because that is specialized in a way. Some of that is going to look quite different than working with student life and culture records or faculty papers. So I think also we've kind of based it on even just with some of the ways that we've cultivated relationships as well. And I did want to just point out that Angel Diaz noted Project Stan's toolkit for archiving student activism, and that's something that we've been very much reviewing and have found it very helpful and very thoughtful about questions to ask, especially regarding materials related to student activism.
Great. Well, I think we'll end it here. Thank you again, Jessica and Bethany, for sharing your valuable knowledge and insight. We really appreciate it. This is also a reminder for those of you who are interested in the next webinar. It will happen on April 15th, which is a Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Just hop up to that link at the top of the chat and you'll be linked out to those webinars. So a big round of applause again for Jessica and Bethany, and we'll see y'all next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.